This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so everybody, welcome to this is our fourth learning community this year. And we've got one more event that the QEP is doing on April 17th that we'll be seeing more about. We're calling it like a speaker and preview day, QEP preview day. So the speaker who's going to be actually Skyping in is Dr. James Romsberg from University of Wisconsin. He specializes in rhetoric and composition, specifically working class studies. So he's going to share some of the ways he's learned to basically teach to the interests and value systems of working class students who are more and more populating colleges. So that should be fun. And then we'll do lunch, and then our plan for the preview event is really just finding a way to connect those of you who are like solid QEPers now, you've been doing this for a while, with brand new people who are rolling in this next year. So opportunities for people to just kind of meet and greet and share resources and feel like we've got a sense of where we're going next year before summer starts and we all, or at least I, empty my entire brain out. Never again. So thanks so much for coming. And yeah, we're going to do source acknowledgement and plagiarism today, because actually we had one meeting with I think it was either allies or steering committee, where we talked about plagiarism for like half the time. And I was like, oh, this is a hot topic. Yeah, let's do this. So Leah and I kind of collaborated on it and talked about it. And we're like, okay, yeah, let's bring in some more voices. Let's do a little panel situation. So everybody knows I kind of gave them a sense of what I want to ask, and I'll be facilitating the panel, and we'll kind of move through the questions and then give a chance for you guys to give input. But at any point, you know, if you've got a direct follow-up or something, please feel free to chime in. So I want to start off just with kind of what are you seeing in the classroom as far as the student's ability to integrate sources? Like, what are some areas where you see a need for improvement? Or maybe you don't, maybe they're just rocking it. And for Leah, of course, it's, you know, a lot of the work you do, you're coming into classes specifically to teach that. So, but also from your perspective, what you see.
Okay, so I'll start. And I don't know that I have any wonderful insights on this that probably most of you don't have, but what I would say is that I see a couple of things. One is that because many of the writing projects that I have students doing, or the writing assignments I have them doing, are in order for them to present that information in class, so to do a presentation or a speech. And so making the transition, sometimes they think that because they're writing it for presentation, they don't need to cite sources in the same way. And so talking about the difference between citing sources and relying on information in writing versus speaking is one of the things that I see. And then also, I mean, students rely on the information that they can find quickly. What I found is, you know, they really like to do a really quick search, usually on Google, but sometimes they'll even search the databases and they'll just go with the first one or two things that they find. And so not really looking at those things in depth and thinking about what kind of information they need, but just sort of taking the first thing that they find. And that leads them oftentimes to using websites and other things that are probably not the best sources. I did bring one handout today, and it's something, you may use something very similar. I've seen various versions of this, but it's called the CRAP test. And it's for, you know, currency, relevance, authority, and purpose. So if students are using a website, even if it's a government site or if it's a university site or anything outside of the databases, I make them fill out this form and turn it in along with the papers, just so I know that they've gotten enough have it and they've reviewed that site and have thought about the quality of information. So I think, yeah, those are the two major things that I see is pulling things that are just easy and quick rather than really thinking more deeply about it, and trying to make that transition from writing to speaking.
We should be sharing that form after this.
Yes, I actually have them, so I'll pass them.
Oh, wonderful. I told them this crew loves handouts. I was like, bring your handouts with you. And I should make sure y'all do this such useful handouts. Also, in case anyone's watching or attending remotely, I think everyone in this room knows everybody up here, but I should have done introductions. So of course, Donna Elkins, School of Communication. We've got Leah Cover with the library, and then Jennifer Doyle with natural science. For our panelists. My other panelists, what do you think?
Oh, are we moving on?
Either way.
I would just piggyback off of that. The second thing you said was sort of, choosing quick sources that are available, and kind of saying, I often also see students, in my limited view, going into classes once or twice a session, seeing students kind of choosing the first, 5 or 10 sources or however many they need for a class or a paper or something, and then writing to those sources as opposed to thinking the other way of what is my argument and what sources do I need to really make a point or support my claim or something. So I think that's something I see a lot is sort of, just thinking about and this is maybe something I'll say 10 times today, is sort of thinking about the research process as almost mirroring the writing process as this thing that you kind of have to go around this, circle so many times. There's not just you do the research and then you write. It's you start your research, you write, you go back, you're always having to think about, go back between those two. What is my claim or my argument, and then thinking about how to support that effectively, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Okay. And moving on with that, actually, and with the different references that they have, a lot of times I feel that students have a trouble kind of melting them together, so to speak. So they'll cite one source around the topic, and then they'll use a totally different source around a different topic instead of using multiple sources to kind of bring the ideas together. I think that's always a hurdle for my students, I find, especially for pulling things from, first publication scientific journal articles that are explaining these experiments. How are they putting those experiments together to cover their particular topic? And I think they have a hard time with that. I think they're really good at writing a paragraph using one reference and then writing the next paragraph using a different reference, but to actually put that together, and that's tricky. That's not an easy thing to do. And I let my students know this is difficult. And it does require that deeper thinking about your ideas and what you are literally trying to say in your paper. Not just, and I'm not saying they're plagiarizing and just spitting out. I mean, they definitely are trying to put in their own words. But yeah, I think that's difficult for them, so a paragraph or two should have multiple references, not just one paragraph, one reference, next paragraph, another reference. Melting them, so to speak, together is something I find for my students.
Thank you, guys. So the next question is, thinking of all that, how do you scaffold the research process or build research into the writing process? So I think just sharing generally, how do you build a research assignment? What does that look like in your class? And what are the different moves you make in that 6-week session? Or for you, Leah, when you're brought into a class, you only have maybe 2 days or 1 day you're working with them too. How do you scaffold it for them so that they're not just totally overwhelmed with these huge barriers that we've already discussed, that these barriers to them really being able to write research fluently and write about it?
Defer to you two first, since you're giving us.
Well, the only PETF part so far is a biology seminar course. So really the whole 6 weeks is dedicated to doing research on a student decided topic and spending the time to read through that literature and doing presentations based on different articles they find, and then culminating in basically a lit review. In my head, I think of it as a practice of like chapter 1 on a thesis or dissertation, where you're not really talking about your work, you're collecting all the background, and then that would justify the works in chapter 2 and 3. So in my head, that's kind of the goal where I was trying to make this assignment. So we start in day 1 with starting to develop the topic, because that's not easy. And then when we meet with Leah, she's fantastic, to help with further developing the topic, looking at references. I make them for a certain number do more of an annotated bibliography. I have a handout so that they immediately fill out in bullet points, note taking, exactly, the main hypothesis of the research article they're looking at, what are the main methods, what are the results, and then what does that author conclude from those results, so that they have these. So when they're starting to put down, and I also make them do an outline, a paper outline, just so they can play around with order. They already have those worksheets. They don't, yes, they have the reference and the actual articles, but they have their notes. And they use those notes then to build the outline. And then they can, on the outline, say, okay, page 2 of notes. This is what I want to reference for this topic. And then we go on and review and go back and forth before we do the rough draft. So I think scaffolding it by doing the annotated bibliography, the outline, and making those actually worth points makes them spend a little bit more time on that even before they even start. That seems to have worked well.
Could you talk a little bit about the peer review experience you had with
Yeah.
outlines?
Oh, yeah.
Because
So
I think that connects with what you were saying about when it comes to something like a lit review, students really not knowing how to structure the thing.
exactly. So we had, this is the first time we did a peer review on the outline in session 3. And I thank the Writing Center for helping to facilitate that. That was fantastic. So we peer reviewed their paper outline. And I think having a student write the outline, and in their head it makes sense, but then having to explain it to their peer why they chose this order made them realize that maybe I should move this up to the top, or maybe my introduction needs a little bit more work before we cover these other kind of parts. And I really felt, and that actually was the #1 like praise of the student, was the peer review of the outline, because they felt that when they actually sat down to write, they already in their head had a way of like, okay, I'm starting here, then we're moving here, then I'm wrapping it up here, because they could follow that outline. It was a surprise. I mean, I thought it would be good, but when things really work better than expected, you're always. So it was, I'm going to do it every time now. I really think that's interesting. Especially it gives them, because by the time you get to a rough draft, it's a lot of words. The outline, I think, being kind of more of a bullet point, is easier to get into quickly in a peer review.
Well, it's just like doing a shorter first draft.
It is, yeah.
It's like that way before they've, gotten lost in it, you can really change directions if you need to in that early stage of their thinking. And we didn't know how it's going to work. I was like, oh, cool, you're going to be peer review with an outline. I have no idea if that's going to work, but let's try it. I was like, that sounds
yeah. Another thing that brought up is because they had their annotated bibliography, so they could kind of tie it to their outline, they saw what part of their paper do they need to go back and get some more references for. And it was easier, I think, to see at that level than once they got into the actual writing process. So like, oh, this part really needs to be beefed up, so to speak. And then there were other students who had, you know, the middles, the middle topics, I guess. They had ones that, oh, do I really need that? Like, is that helping? And so I think the outlines just make it more obvious, I guess, to the student, what more they need to include, or what, just as important, I think, what less they need to include, you know, taking them out, editing really the topics. Bless you.
Thank you. And feel free, guys, to go back and forth from the food table if you need to get food, drinks. For you the other two, how do you incorporate research into just kind of scaffolding?
Well, I actually took some ideas from Jennifer. And in the capstone class that I'm teaching right now, so one of the things we did this time was we actually did a peer review of their topics, which is one of the things that she talked about. And I had them come with 3 different possible topics that they might write about. Some of them came with variations on those topics. And we actually put them up on flip charts, and they stood up and explained them to everybody. And then other people in the class had the opportunity to talk with them about what they thought or what they've read. So I think we did a better job at the beginning of them having thought through the topic that they wanted to start with. Because in the past, it's been kind of, you know, develop your topic, I'll talk to them about a little bit. And I think getting that input was helpful. And then we, just this past week when we met, we watched a short, like a 5-minute video about reading journal articles that I think was really helpful for them. Because I sometimes talk with them about my own writing process. And usually when I'm doing the capstone in the spring, I try to be writing something myself, or, you know, finishing up. This time I happened to be writing 2 different articles that I was working on, but I try to share that with them. And, you know, these are some of the things that I'm going through, and I'm struggling here. And we talked about not just how to find the articles, but also like, how do you create a filing system so you can go back to that? And I guarantee you, I mean, I am not the expert at that because I show them sometimes my files, like for my dissertation or from other things I've read, and said, see, I spend, you know, how much time going back trying to figure out which article this was in. So we use some of those, you know, like worksheets to kind of keep that straight and just talk about what that process looks like, and the going back and forth. And yes, you may read this and think you'll remember exactly where this was and which article it was in, but how do you, you know, make notes, or how do you somehow highlight that so that when you need to go back and find it, you can. And then we actually, this time, so we watched the short video. We talked about some of the things in reading an article, and then I gave them about 45 minutes, and they went out and found at least 3 sources that they thought they might be able to use in their paper. And then we got back together, and actually I had them sort of peer review those and talk about, why do you think this article would be helpful? What did you find there? It was really interesting because one of the things that they talked a lot about in a couple of cases were terminology. And, you know, kind of starting to learn what the terminology is around this subject. And that gave them ideas for other things that they could, you know, other terms they could use to search. So I think in the past, I've kind of talked about that and then just sent them out on their own to do it. And actually, you know, taking the time to do some of that together, you know, transparently in class and think through it, has been helpful scaffolding. We sometimes in the earlier classes in our program, one of the things that I'll do usually is try to choose some sort of article, or even sometimes something in our textbook, and just pull out some examples of the way things are cited. You know, if it's a direct quote, or if it's a paraphrase, or how it's incorporated, like you said, integrated into that paragraph. You know, looking at examples sometimes, because when they're reading a textbook or they're reading a text, they sometimes don't take the time to stop and actually look at those as examples. So that's another way that I try to work with earlier writers in the program as well.
I'm gonna piggyback that. I mean, I think one thing that I try to do in classes a lot is kind of focus on that like pre-writing, pre-research, like topic development phase, and really like lean into that as an important. I mean, this is like leading up to the source stuff, but you know, kind of again going back to that that idea that a lot of students I think will be like, okay, I chose this topic. Like I didn't really, maybe some students think really deeply about that. Some I think don't. Like I just have to choose a topic. I'll choose a topic. And so kind of getting them to think, yeah, kind of bounce their ideas around and start doing some pre-searching or like pre-research just to see like what is out there already on this topic. Like what can I find and how does that influence where I might go differently or what kind of a, you know, path might that lead me down, or, you know, just always thinking of like doing kind of like a mind map thing of like, these are a bunch of words that I associate with this topic. And then that would be like, oh, and then this makes me think about this. And, you know, this could be a subtopic that's actually much more interesting than just trying to do this whole big thing and trying to do that in like 4 to 6 pages or something, which can be both very overwhelming. And I guess the other thing that I have done recently, actually, that I'm excited about is, so thinking about like an outline and thinking about, you know, the idea of like helping to guide a student to think about like, what am I doing in this writing? Where am I going with this writing? And so you were kind of talking about like, you know, having them review an outline so that they can kind of see like all in one small space before they get into the thousands of words of like, what am I doing here? What am I doing here? What am I doing here? So recently I was talking with Dr. Kim and one of her English one-time classes, and you know, she kind of like, you know, it was the first time I was working with her, and so she was kind of pushing, you know, asking a lot of questions like, what are you going to be doing? And I was like, great question, you know, thank you. So it was a nice conversation, and she was kind of, you know, mentioning like, I really wanted to make sure that they're using sources that are relevant to their point that they're making, and also that they're like using good sources. And I was like, yeah, great. Okay, so how can I kind of do an activity to, you know, to kind of dive into that a little bit. And so we ended up doing a reverse outline of a written argument. So I just grabbed something from like what I consider kind of real life persuasive art or writing. I found a blog on HuffPost that, what was it called? Like, doctors need to talk about death instead of trying to keep patients alive at any cost. So it was a surgeon who was writing from the perspective of someone who often has those conversations with patients about like, you know, here are your options. We don't necessarily have to just do an aggressive chemo treatment or something like that. It was a really effective article. It was pretty short, but it started off with just like kind of her personal experience, like telling us who she is, what she does. And then she gives like a short anecdote about, you know, actually having this kind of conversation with a person who is terminally ill. And then, you know, so it's like a very effective sort of strategy in terms of setting you up of like, all right, I trust this person more or less, you know, and I'm drawn into this topic because of this story. And then she like kind of switches tone and suddenly just gives you a bunch of like an argument, you know, statistics. It's like, you know, 80% of Americans want to die at home, but only 20% do or something. And you're like, oh, I don't know that, you know. So we kind of did this activity of having them first read the article, and, you know, I had them like annotate and like pay attention to the moments as like a first time reader that kind of like struck you or hit you or something, and kind of taking advantage of like, it was an emotional and heavy article, and maybe I would choose something a little less heavy. But, you know, I think it was helpful in the sense that they were like, oh, like, you know, when they said this really like caught my attention or made me feel a certain way, or made me think a certain thing. And so I had them kind of go through and just like annotate and read and think about like what the different sections were doing in terms of like making an argument. And then I had them kind of discuss that, and we all talked about it. And then the sort of second round was, I was like, okay, you're going to read it again, because like every source that you're engaging with, you should read multiple times. And so the second time through, they kind of went through and focused on the actual sources and like whether, like what the sources were doing, whether they were actually relevant. Like I had them actually follow the hyperlinks and open them up and say, like, does this actually reflect and, you know, actually adequately support the claims they're making here? And, you know, that can be a longer discussion about source evaluation and stuff. But then we also, you know, I had them kind of like make note of the places in the article where you're like, well, like, why do I believe you when you just say this? Or not? So kind of getting them to think a little bit about the why behind citing of like, you know, every time you see something that could be a little bit questionable or that you have questions about, there really should be like a path to follow there. Well, I feel like I'm talking about so good stuff.
It's really interesting. Is everyone familiar with reverse outlining as a strategy? So it's like we use it in the writing center too, and so it's fun when I find that we use the same terms even though you're teaching research and
Yeah,
we're
well, I'm still gonna do all.
cool. Okay, I was like, reverse outline, that's a writing center word.
Yeah.
So if anyone hasn't heard of it, it's just the student. So instead of an outline where you start with your headings and the ideas later on, you elaborate on each part. You start with a fully written piece, and you try to distill each paragraph down to maybe a sentence that they write in the margin, or maybe just a quick few notes that they try to say, like what's happening in this paragraph? What is this paragraph doing? What kind of appeals is it making kind of on behalf of like the writer, and how does it fit within the paper? So it can be really helpful when you're looking at models for students, because they might know what a good research paper looks like. They may have read one, doesn't mean they can do it. So that step of kind of breaking it down, how did this person handle it? How did they actually, how was the sausage made? How did this come out sounding good and having a good flow? You know, a lot of the words that students will use for it, it's like demystifying that stuff. Okay, a lot of work went into making that sound like it flowed well.
And
That just magically happened.
Yeah, that's something that I always like say before, or I mean, I've done this twice now, but like that I've said both times is sort of like one thing that I know about good writers is that they are big readers. Like there's a reason that writers, you know, like they see a lot of different examples and they're like, oh, that worked for me, and then they can imitate that and make it their own. And so that's what I was, you know, I was like, for me, this worked. And if I were to make an argument, I would think about like why I'm writing, you know, thinking about my position. And then like, you know, for me, like narrative really hits me in a certain way. I mean, depending on context, but, you know, so we had kind of a discussion about just like why the author did what they did. And then thinking deeper about like the sources they used.
And with Donna, like using your own work for that is, I think it's really effective, and it creates more of an equal playing field where they see that like, you know, that writing a research piece is hard for everyone. Like even though you have a lot to teach them and you know more than they do about how to do this particular task, that you're still struggling with it and you're still learning. Yeah. So I want to, now that we've talked about, we wanted to start with talking about source integration before we move into talking about, now I want to kind of move towards talking about defining plagiarism. How do you deal with it when it comes up? Because obviously in a perfect world, like you would teach source integration and it would make plagiarism impossible, right? We don't live in that world. So how do you define and teach the concept of plagiarism? So before it even comes up, without even detecting plagiarism in a paper, like how in any class that you teach that's research oriented, how do you deal with explaining what it is? You make a big plagiarism model that stands in the corner. Like I feel like there's a lot of scary rhetoric in plagiarism. I'm curious like how people deal with it. Maybe it's less scary.
Well, I don't know if it's less scary, but I always talk about plagiarism as stealing. I mean, you know, that's the metaphor I use, where it's not really even a metaphor. I say, you know, plagiarism is stealing. It's taking something that is not yours and acting as if you own it, as if it belongs to you. And I think sometimes it's harder for us to have that concept, or it's harder for students to have that concept when it comes to words or ideas than it is. So we, you know, in some of my beginning speech classes, for instance, we'll actually talk about, you know, if I walk over and take your notebook off your desk, is that, you know, that's stealing. That's taking something of yours and then just using it as if it were mine, and, you know, acting as if it were mine. And so we talk about it in those terms. But I tell them that when you write, what you should be doing is borrowing. you're borrowing those ideas from somebody else, and using them, and, you know, you give that person credit, that it still belongs to them, but you're using it temporarily, or you're using it in your own work. So that's kind of the metaphor that I use, but I like the idea of sort of building a monster.
We just talked about it in this, because, but, well, the QEP that I just tied are seniors. I mean, they realize that they can't just copy somebody else's work. The discussions that we have are more about the kind of nuances. So, you know, if you cite a source, you still can't use, like, you can't just plop the sentence from the source without putting quotes, or you have to do more than just change like an adjective in the sentence. And so, kind of more of those details. This chart isn't perfect, but I actually bought the teacher's license to it. It's this kind of chart that I plagiarized. I brought, I don't know if I made enough copies. The source is cited down here, and I do have a teacher's license, so I'm allowed to share this. So I'm not plagiarizing, but I'll pass this around. I do not think this is 100% perfect, what is, but, and also with the license, I can put it up on Moodle since it's password. So basically, I just like this because there's kind of like a gradient of like my oats, you know, was I sloppy with my citation? Did I let a few sentences go before I cited the source? Those are typically what I personally feel like I help students clean up. You know, by the time I get it, the student's not going to be like, oh, well, copy, paste, it's mine. Not to say that that doesn't happen, because I'm sure it 100% does. But I think just that students should realize that there is this kind of lighter plagiarism. Does that make
Lighter
sense?
side, like
The lighter, yeah, exactly. I mean, there's some monsterish things here, you know. Again, I could probably argue a couple of these things, but I think for the student to see this kind of very visual, walking through the steps, it's just something for them to think about. Extra copy. If anybody wants to look at it, yeah. So that's what our discussions typically are. And then another one that comes up a lot, but I think that chart calls it mosaic. I get certain students will be like, according to so-and-so, quotes, next paragraph. But so-and-so said, quotes. You know, so it's to the point where and when I get those, what I do is I highlight the unquoted stuff and send it back to the student and said, in actuality, you wrote maybe a paragraph. You know, so let's go back to the drawing board here. Now that's once in a blue moon, but that's typically what I have seen come up. That, and then a few sentences, and then quote or put the reference, the citation, the in-text citation. That's those are kind of the conversations we have. Because I think the 109 and 110 and all that, and others have done a great job of saying, well, you can't just copy and paste. Those are what I run into, and that's where our conversations are. We go through this, and then it's usually a one-on-one being like, you know, I think you were a little sloppy with your citations here. You need to go back. I know that you have it, and I know this isn't an intentional plagiarism thing, but let's go back and let's clean this area up a bit.
I like the clean this area. I like clean it up.
Right, because I know it's not intentional. They're not intentionally saying this is mine, but it could cite a little better.
And I really like your idea, like I loved, I don't know if you said this verbatim or not, but what I heard was like, you should be borrowing. And I think that's a really important thing to like emphasize, because I think something that I get a sense from students sometimes is like, I have to create all of this information from a vacuum in my head. And it's like, no, like any, you should be referencing like as many, credible or, valuable sources. Like that makes you even more credible the more that you cite good sources. And that's something that like, we talk about when a student might find a website, like an essay or something. And one of my sort of like guiding questions is like, if they're like, well, is this good? Like, is this a good source? Well, let's like look through and see. And if what I often say is if you don't see any citations, unless it's like a personal blog about somebody's experience, like firsthand experience or feelings about the thing, like there should be lots and lots of sources, telling us where they got their information. So that should be hopefully like I don't know, kind of a guiding principle is like the more that you're borrowing, effectively and ethically, like the stronger you are. I don't know.
So how about when it goes wrong? So you've got a paper in front of you, and so how do you detect and address the plagiarism when you do encounter it? What's your process like for that?
I just flag it and say, fix. Like, if this is an area, fix it. Because like I said, right, I really do, I don't think when I've caught it, I really deep down don't think it was an intentional thing. I think it was just that, so I make it more of a learning process.
Yeah.
I don't wag my finger and things, but yeah, I do. I'm like,
We
this
need to
area.
identify that image of what our monster's gonna look like.
Uh-huh.
Attention.
I had a biochem professor who, we had to write a paper, and he was upset at the way that some of us wrote or drew the chemical formulas, and all he would call it the big red P. And he would just in red P when he thought that plagiarism had occurred or that we didn't cite it correctly, nothing more, just the big red P. And again, because he realized that nothing was intentional, this is a learning process. That needs to be fixed, so.
One of the things I have wondered about though is, and it's very rare that I see one of those, on the
Yeah.
far,
Right.
or the far right of the sheet you were talking about. But I have seen that. And one of the things that we've talked about even in our department is how do we sort of flag that student so that if it does happen again in another class or it does happen again later, that we know that it's already happened previously, because sometimes that's a hard thing too, as you see it and you think, I think it's unintentional. And the first time, or maybe even the first couple times something like that happens, you could say they're just still learning. But eventually, how do we identify those students so we know that this is a recurring problem for them? And I think that's, that's a big question, because I don't use Turnitin or any of those kinds of I don't use any software. I just try to do it based on knowing the student, seeing their writing patterns. If I see something that I think is kind of questionable, I'll either go to the source, or sometimes I'll just Google that phrase and see if I find it. And I'll kind of spot check, some of the sources, especially if it's something I'm not familiar with. And, it just depends on what it is as to how I would approach it. If I really do, like you said, think it's, unintentional, I'll point it out. Or sometimes it's just they didn't use quotation marks and they should have, and I know that, that was unintentional. And so if it's a small assignment, usually the first time I'll point it out and ask them to revise. If it's a small assignment, I may take some points off. But it's usually not, I'll usually give them a chance to revise before I do that. But if it's, and if they don't do it differently the next time, if it happens again, then that penalty gets larger usually. But yeah, I think I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. I've seen just a couple cases probably where it was intentional. And a lot of times it was just people who are really pressed for time, students who are really pressed for time, and they just, are trying to get by. And, we used to say, if you write your assignments in such a way that they're unique, they can't go out and find, something already done, but I think that's becoming harder and harder too. It's really, I know, I remember in our conversation, Robin Hinkle was saying that she has in her, in the MSBC program, where they have to write about their own leadership style. And it's something that you would think nobody would plagiarize, but she actually had a student who just went out and looked at somebody else's leadership style. And, and again, I think it's one of those situations where you're so pressed for time, or you're really just stressed and you're like, I'm just going to take this rather than, taking the time to write my own. So, yeah, but I do wonder about, if there are ways even through our program where we could kind of check in with students and see if this is happening multiple times, then maybe we need to address it a little more.
Maybe with that new platform they're rolling out.
Oh, yeah.
I thought about that with the Navigate. Maybe there's some way to put notes in if it's something egregious, not just for small things, but something big.
Yeah, and I don't know if this question applies to you as much, Leah, because you're not in that role with students. You get to be you're the fun teacher, the grading teacher. But is there a question that you ask that can get someone to talk about why they plagiarize without putting them on defense too much? Because I feel like I've heard people talk about questions. I've never really found a wording. Like one thing would be, why did you present this section as your ideas? What was your motivation for presenting this in the way that, without quotations? It's pretty hard hitting though. But it's like when you know that what they've done is blatant and it must be intentional, I think it might be helpful to have some open-ended questions in your back pocket of what feels good to you. Yeah.
So we have this happen actually quite often, more often than I would have expected with plagiarism in the nursing program. I'm not sure if it's because they're not as experienced in writing, because we're trained more in a different way of testing. I'm not sure. But one thing I was just going to mention is that when we start off the course, we talk. That's how we started. We start when you start talking about the fact that we're going to have writing assignments, the fact that we're going to be doing research, the fact that we're going to be presenting our work, is how can we set ourselves up for success? And so looking at why we've been looking at, is it because we're busy, that is it because we are not as secure in some of our writing? Is it because we might have some learning differences that, make us feel a little bit more, vulnerable? Or what is it that is going on that could put us in situations where we feel like what we're going to put out there is not going to be the standard? Is that we have so much writing, that school's so expensive, that we have so much on the line, that we want to make sure we get the grade that we need in order to move forward. And so I think that's how we start off the conversation about what would we do if we realize we only have a couple hours and it's 2 o'clock in the morning, you don't have a paper done. Like what are some other things that we could do rather than putting ourselves in that situation? If it is peer review, this is one thing that we've talked about last week with QP, is when you put your work out there and everyone else can see it, it's a really vulnerable place. And if you're going to get feedback on it, it's even more really, really vulnerable. So would that be a place where maybe we would want to put our own work, because people can't be cruel and it can be really hurt. And so I think that's something maybe rather than going
empathy, even when it's intentional, still applying that empathy. It sounds
having
like
those conversations about what are situations that may lead, like psychology of it. What are situations that may lead to someone, either they don't have the skills to put it out there. What are some of the resources we have on campus? What are some of the ways that we can set ourselves up for success with time management, with writing help, with writing support, all of those kind of things. And that way, when it does come down to a situation where plagiarism is suspected, which had on numerous occasions. You can say, well, do you remember we had those conversations about this, and is there anything that's going on? You know, is there anything going on with it? What happened? You know, how can we get to the point of what really happened? What's really going on? Because I think that, at least in my experience, in talking to students who have plagiarized, there's a lot more there than, I mean, I've had it where you're at this end of the identity theft and the copycat, and I've had it at this end, and there's usually something more, whether it's that they're feeling insecure about their writing, or they're I mean, or they just didn't care, they don't really want to be in the program, they're just trying to make it through, or whatever, or they didn't, you know, there's just more there.
I would like to ask about self-plagiarism. Because, well, a couple of years ago, in the program, we had the students put their papers to turn it in. And it came back as, because all their papers were in there, then it came back as themselves. It wasn't a large percentage. But I always think, how can I plagiarize myself? You know, it's not like they were submitting the whole paper over again, but had used pieces of what they had already done. And the faculty member that was involved dealt with it very severely. And I thought it was her own work.
But I think when we read journal articles, when the authors quote themselves, they simply cite if it's a published manuscript or an unpublished manuscript. If it's unpublished, the date it was produced and when it was submitted. So you can still cite yourself without any difficulty.
I don't know that a student would.
They wouldn't know that probably, but we could show them that in some of the articles that we share.
Good point.
And the stuff that just kind of quickly online to when I further kind of understand this whole idea of plagiarism, because it is a broader scope than just copying. That comes up often as debate. And the way I understand it is that people debate it either way. If it's your work and it's unpublished, and you might, you know, have it. Everybody pretty much agrees you can't just regurgitate the same thing. But your ideas are your ideas. And so I don't know the best way to deal with that. I think a lot of people grapple with that issue. It's hard
It
when
was
it's
not, the one thing we talked about, and I haven't personally used turned it in, I've just heard people talk about it, and especially in the writing center, it kind of, I don't know, we kind of sigh about turned it in sometimes because it comes back with these like high ratings of plagiarism that are usually not accurate because the system's just not smart enough. So sometimes it's like, it's reading the whole body of papers, and it even thinks that students are plagiarizing each other. But it's really, they're just in that same incubator of thought.
Yeah.
They're producing similar sentence patterns and things that may have been stressed a lot in the course. Or one paper that built up to another paper, for example, that you said that was totally fine for them to do.
And I can imagine within a discipline, I mean, assignments are going to have a certain degree of overlap.
I know like in mainstream publishing though, like with like mainstream outlets, articles, things like that, on the internet, even blog posts, self-plagiarism is a huge thing because those sites will get deemed on their SEO or Google will strip a site. So even like as a content writer, I used to write like 40,000 words a week, various blog posts for dentists, ghostwriting them. And if any of those blog posts, even though they were writing for 20 different dentists on the exact same topic, if any of that was self-plagiarized, that would be your job. So like down to the sentence. So like, I mean, it's real tight out here. Like they're really strict about it.
That's another reason why I kind of like Turnitin now, because if you were to use Turnitin, I recently had a student in an online course who asked me, I was so proud of the student, they asked me, they said, you know, I had the same assignment in another, it was for writing an app and then developing the app and then writing about it. And so I did the same thing in a social work course. Could I use that, what I did there? And I said, well, you can use a topic, but let's see how we can grow on it. Let's see how we can, have a different spin or expand or, thank you for being conscious of that. But without turning it in, if the student hadn't come to me, they could have just basically submitted the same paper in 2 courses, maybe more, depending on, it was a topic that could have lent itself to a psychology class, to another class. So I kind of liked it for that reason, because otherwise you can submit the same paper like 3 or 4 times, and it's yours.
The other thing I like about it is it just kind of alerts the students that we're checking.
Right.
That, I have to turn it in, and I know something is going to be checking. Maybe I might not be quite as cut and paste-ish as the platform or whatever.
Any other questions or comments? We just have a couple minutes. Anything from the panel today that stirred ideas for you or things that you want to follow up on? I will send out that awesome graphic.
I also have activities here that I.
Ooh,
All right, there's more handouts.
A plus panel, All the best.
Thanks, Lee. Did you want to share any? I think you. Most of mine is encountered in the grad level, which really shifts to them a little bit. Though I'm gonna remember it, but I was at the QED steering committee when we had our just kind of brainstorming about what are the stuff. So I'm glad that we're diving in. And thank you, panel, really, great job.
Everything you're gonna share. All right, thanks, everybody. So, like I said, April 17th, you'll see some stuff coming out about it. That's gonna be the speaker, the QEP's bringing in, and a little preview event to connect people, kind of a little QEP mentoring.
Story. Not watched This Is Us this week, but last week getting to see older Kevin.
I wanted to put
He was
out
a total smoke show. I was like, I did not realize this made you get more attractive, and yet here we are.
When Susie sent out that email about the award, the QEP award, we're not going to be able to have any funding. I really felt bad for you. I had to send out that second email. So I told her, I said, well, what if we all just donated some gift cards? I went and bought a $25 Fandango gift card and gave it to her so that if we all contributed something, then the person would get something. It might not be, it would be, was it $100?
Yeah, well, the original.
$1,000.
Development for,
Oh,
um,
The statues, the awards.